Hi, it's Zune. Today I'm going to show you how to make this ruffle swing top with an open back. You can print out the free pattern at zunesewingtherapy.com. Okay, let's start off by adding the seam allowances. I added 1/4 of an inch to the inner circle on the ruffle pattern. Add seam allowance to the outer circle if your fabric is woven, but if you're using a knit fabric, you can leave the edges raw like I did. I also added 1/4 of an inch to the neck and the armhole, 3/8 of an inch to the shoulders and side seams. Add a hem allowance if you're using a woven. I used my rotary cutter to get neat edges, which is important because my hem will be left unfinished. Cut the 2 ruffle circles open. The neck and armholes will be finished with a binding, so cut a long strip 1 1/4 inches wide straight across from the selvage. If your fabric is lightweight like mine, you can add some stay tape to avoid droopiness in areas such as the shoulders and necklines. I'm using a stay tape that I made myself. It's really easy. You can use a yard or so of fusible knit interfacing and cut strips diagonally from the selvage. Next, take each end of the open circles and sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If the seam being in the front of the garment bothers you, you can cover it with some lace or a bit of ribbon. Either way, it will still look very pretty. Let's attach the ruffles to the neckline. Place the wrong side of the ruffle on the right side of the neckline and pin it all around. Baste the 2 layers together 1/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Sew the binding into a loop with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press the seam allowance open. Fold the binding in half lengthwise and pin it around the neckline on top of the ruffles. Sew all the layers together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trim off the excess seam allowance. Fold the binding towards the inside of the neck. Move the ruffles away and then top stitch the binding to the garment. The binding will make the neckline look rounded, so to get the V-shape back, fold the garment's back in half, move away the ruffles, and sew a short straight line on the binding, stopping at the seam. Close the side seam by pinning the right sides together and sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Cut out 2 binding strips for the armholes. The armholes will be finished with binding the same way as the neckline. Sew the binding into a loop and press the seam allowance open. Then fold the binding in half lengthwise and pin it on the right side of the armhole. Sew the folded binding to the armhole with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and trim off the excess seam allowance. Then fold the binding over onto the wrong side of the armhole and top stitch. If you're using a woven fabric, then the last step for you will be the hemming. But if you're using a knit, then you can leave the edges raw. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for sewing along with me, and see you next time.